They thought you would never see it. They thought you would stay quiet, confused, and easy to control. But something shifted, and now everything is different. Chosen one, this is not just another message, this is your confirmation. The blindfold is off. The illusions have shattered, and for the first time, you're seeing people, especially your own family, for who they truly are, not who you were conditioned to believe they were. That uncomfortable feeling in your chest, that's clarity. Those memories resurfacing, that's truth demanding to be acknowledged. You're connecting dots you were never supposed to connect. And now, the very people who once underestimated you are beginning to feel it, that silent shift in your energy. They can't manipulate you the same way anymore. They can't access the old version of you. And yes, they're horrified. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because you've finally woken up. This is the moment many never reach. It takes strength to break out of emotional conditioning. It takes courage to see betrayal where you once saw love. And it takes power to walk in truth, even when it shakes your entire foundation. In this video, you're going to understand why this awakening had to happen, why their behavior is changing now, and what it truly means for your next level. If you've been feeling this shift, this message is not a coincidence. You were meant to find this. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change how you see everything. You were conditioned to misread pain as love. You were taught a version of love that came with conditions, confusion, and quiet suffering. It didn't always look harmful on the surface. Sometimes it was subtle, almost invisible. It showed up as being ignored when you needed support, criticized when you expressed yourself, or made to feel guilty for having boundaries. Over time, these patterns became familiar, and what becomes familiar often gets mistaken for what is normal. So you adapted. You learned to tolerate emotional distance and call it independence. You accepted inconsistency and labeled it love. You overlooked manipulation because it came from people you were told to trust. In that environment, love wasn't something that felt safe. It was something you had to earn, maintain, and protect, even at the cost of yourself. But awakening changes everything. Now, your awareness is sharper. You're no longer just feeling, you're understanding. You're recognizing the difference between genuine care and emotional control. You're seeing that love is not supposed to drain you, silence you, or make you question your worth. And with that realization comes a deep internal shift. You can't go back to what you once accepted. The same behaviors that once felt normal now feel heavy, uncomfortable, even unacceptable. Conversations you once tolerated now feel forced. Dynamics you once endured now feel misaligned. And the hardest part, the people around you don't understand why you've changed, but you haven't changed. You've awakened. Your refusal to keep calling pain love disrupts the entire dynamic. It removes the illusion that everything was okay. It challenges patterns that were never questioned. And for those who benefited from your silence and tolerance, your clarity feels like resistance. This is where your power truly lies. Not in confrontation, but in recognition. Not in proving a point, but in no longer participating in what harms you. Because once you see clearly, you don't need to fight, you simply choose differently. And that choice changes everything. Your awakening removed the emotional leverage they had. There was a time when your emotions were predictable to them. They knew what would trigger you, what would make you feel guilty, what would pull you back in. Whether it was silence, disappointment, comparison, or subtle rejection, they understood how to shift your emotional state without ever taking responsibility for their actions. And without realizing it, you became responsive to those patterns. That was their leverage, not because you were weak, but because you were open, empathetic, and deeply connected. You cared, and that care made you accessible. It made you someone who would try harder, explain more, forgive faster, and stay longer than you should have. But something changed. Your awakening didn't just give you awareness, it gave you emotional clarity. You began to notice the patterns. You started seeing how certain behaviors were repeated, how certain reactions were expected from you, and slowly, you stepped out of that cycle. You stopped reacting automatically. You paused. You observed. You chose. And that's when their leverage began to disappear. The same tactics don't work anymore. The guilt doesn't land the same. The silence doesn't control you. The emotional pressure no longer dictates your decisions. You've created space between what is done to you and how you respond. And in that space, your power lives. To them, this feels unfamiliar, even threatening. Because they were used to access. They were used to influence. They were used to a version of you that could be emotionally steered. Now, you're grounded, you're aware, you're no longer easily moved by tactics that once worked. And here's the truth. They may not even consciously realize what they were doing, but they feel the shift. They feel that something about you is no longer available in the same way. This is what growth looks like. You didn't become cold, you became clear. You didn't disconnect, you became intentional. And most importantly, you didn't lose your heart. You just stopped handing it to people who used it as leverage. You realized loyalty was used as a tool, not a bond. For a long time, you believed loyalty meant staying no matter how you were treated. You were taught, directly or indirectly, that being loyal meant enduring discomfort, overlooking disrespect, and sacrificing your own needs to keep the peace. It sounded noble. It felt right. But in reality, that version of loyalty was never mutual, it was one-sided. You were loyal to people who were not equally committed to your well-being. You stayed quiet when you should have spoken up. You gave chances when patterns were already clear. You carried emotional weight that was never yours to hold, all in the name of family or love. And because you valued connection, you convinced yourself that endurance was proof of strength. But your awakening exposed something deeper. You began to see that what was called loyalty was often expectation, an unspoken rule that you should remain available, forgiving, and compliant regardless of how you were treated. It wasn't about connection, it was about maintaining control. As long as you stayed loyal in that way, the system remained intact. But you've stepped out of that system now. You've realized that true loyalty is not about suffering in silence, it's about mutual respect, honesty, and emotional safety. It doesn't demand that you shrink yourself to preserve a relationship. It doesn't require you to abandon your truth to keep others comfortable. And once you understand that, everything changes. You stop overextending. You stop explaining yourself to people who don't truly listen. You stop equating tolerance with love. And most importantly, you stop betraying yourself in order to prove your loyalty to others. This is where it becomes uncomfortable for them, because the version of you they were used to, the one who stayed no matter what, is no longer there. Your new understanding of loyalty includes yourself. And when you begin to honor your own boundaries, your own peace, your own truth, it challenges every dynamic that depended on your silence. You didn't become disloyal. You just stopped being loyal to what was hurting you. Your growth exposed the version of you they preferred. Growth doesn't just change you, it reveals what people were comfortable with. And sometimes, what they were comfortable with wasn't your full potential, it was your limitation. There was a version of you that fit neatly into their expectations. Maybe you were quieter, more agreeable, easier to influence. Maybe you second-guessed yourself, sought approval, or avoided confrontation to keep the peace. That version of you was familiar to them, predictable, manageable, but it wasn't the real you. It was the adapted version, the one shaped by environment, pressure, and the need to belong. As you began to grow, something shifted. You started thinking for yourself more clearly. You spoke with more intention. You questioned things you once accepted without hesitation. You became less reactive, more grounded, and far more aware of your worth. And that's when the discomfort began. Because your growth didn't just elevate you, it disrupted what they were used to. The version of you they preferred no longer exists in the same way. And instead of adjusting to your growth, some people struggle with it. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because your evolution requires them to relate to you differently, and not everyone is ready for that. Some may try to remind you of who you used to be. Others may downplay your growth, or act as if you've changed too much. But what they're really reacting to is the loss of the version of you that was easier for them to navigate. This is the truth. Growth is not always celebrated by those who benefited from your smaller self. And that realization can be painful, but it's also freeing, because now you no longer feel the need to shrink to be accepted. You understand that being fully yourself may create distance with some people, but it also aligns you with truth. You didn't become difficult, you became authentic. And authenticity will always challenge environments that were built around a version of you that no longer exists. You broke the unspoken agreement of silence. Every family has its unspoken rules, the things no one writes down, but everyone follows. The tensions that are never addressed. The behaviors that are quietly tolerated. The truths that are felt by everyone, yet spoken by no one. And without realizing it, you were expected to participate in that silence. You learned early that speaking up came with consequences. Maybe it led to being dismissed, misunderstood, or labeled as too sensitive or disrespectful. So you adapted. You kept certain thoughts to yourself. You ignored what didn't feel right. You carried discomfort quietly, convincing yourself that keeping the peace was more important than expressing the truth. That silence became part of the system, because as long as no one named what was happening, everything could continue as it was. The patterns stayed intact, the roles stayed assigned, and the illusion of harmony remained unchallenged. But your awakening disrupted that. Even if you haven't said everything out loud, something in you no longer agrees to that silence. You see too much now. You feel too clearly, and your energy reflects that shift. You're no longer pretending things are okay when they're not. You're no longer participating in conversations that deny reality. You've stepped out of the agreement without needing to announce it. And that alone changes everything. Because when one person stops playing along, the entire dynamic is affected. The silence becomes louder. The tension becomes more noticeable. The things that were once hidden begin to surface, not because you exposed them, but because you're no longer helping to keep them buried. To others, this can feel uncomfortable, even threatening. They may interpret your distance as rebellion or disrespect. But in truth, it's awareness. You're no longer willing to carry what was never yours to hold. You're no longer protecting patterns that caused you harm. This is where your strength shows. Not in creating conflict, but in refusing to participate in denial. Not in forcing others to see, but in honoring what you now understand. Because once you break the silence internally, you've already changed the story, whether anyone else is ready to acknowledge it or not. You no longer internalize what was never yours. For a long time, you carried emotions that didn't originate from you, but you made them your responsibility. You felt guilty for things you didn't cause. You questioned your worth because of how others treated you. You absorbed projections, criticism, and emotional inconsistencies, and slowly they became part of how you saw yourself. You thought, maybe I'm the problem. That belief didn't come from truth, it came from repetition. When you're constantly placed in situations where you're blamed, misunderstood, or made to feel less than, your mind begins to adapt. You start overanalyzing your behavior. You shrink yourself to avoid conflict. You take accountability for things that were never yours to fix. But your awakening shifted that perspective. You began to separate what is yours from what is theirs. You started to recognize patterns, how certain people projected their insecurities, frustrations, or unresolved issues onto you. And instead of automatically absorbing it, you paused. You questioned it. You saw it for what it was, and that changed everything. Because once you stop internalizing what was never yours, you begin to feel lighter. The weight you carried for years starts to lift. You no longer feel responsible for managing everyone else's emotions. You no longer feel the need to explain yourself endlessly just to be understood. You reclaim your space mentally, emotionally, and even spiritually. But here's where the shift becomes uncomfortable for others. They were used to you carrying that weight. They were used to you taking responsibility, apologizing, adjusting, and now that you've stopped doing that, it creates a gap, a silence, a resistance. Because what once landed on you now has nowhere to go, and they feel that. This doesn't mean you've become careless or disconnected. It means you've become aware. You still care, but not at the expense of your truth. You still listen, but you no longer absorb everything as your burden. You didn't lose your compassion. You just stopped turning it inward in ways that were hurting you. Your detachment feels like rejection to them. There was a time when your presence was constant, emotionally available, responsive, and deeply engaged. You showed up even when it drained you. You listened even when you weren't heard. You stayed connected even when the connection wasn't healthy. To them, that version of you felt reliable, accessible, always within reach. But your awakening introduced something unfamiliar: detachment. Not coldness, not bitterness, just clarity. You began to step back, not out of anger, but out of awareness. You stopped over-explaining yourself. You no longer reacted to every comment, every tone, every subtle jab. You created space where there used to be immediate response, and in that space, you found peace. But to them, that peace feels like distance, because they were used to your emotional availability. They were used to being able to reach you, influence you, and engage you on their terms. Now, that access is limited, and when someone loses access they once had, it can feel like rejection, even if that's not your intention. They may say you've changed, that you're distant, that you don't care the same way anymore. But what they're really noticing is this: you no longer engage in the same patterns. You don't chase conversations that lead nowhere. You don't entertain dynamics that drain you. You don't respond from impulse, you respond from awareness. And that shift makes your presence feel different, even though your core hasn't changed. This is the truth. Detachment is not a lack of love, it's a form of self-respect. You're no longer abandoning yourself to maintain connection. You're no longer sacrificing your peace to prove your care. You've learned that you can be present without being consumed, supportive without being controlled, connected without losing yourself. And yes, that can feel unfamiliar to people who benefited from your constant availability. But your role was never to remain accessible at the cost of your well-being. You didn't become distant, you became balanced. And balance often feels like rejection to those who were used to having more of you than they deserved. You recognized the difference between connection and control. For a long time, you believed that closeness meant connection, that being involved, available, and emotionally tied to others was proof of love. But your awakening revealed something deeper. Not everything that feels like connection is genuine. Some bonds are built on control, not care. Control is subtle. It doesn't always show up as force. It often disguises itself as concern, advice, or expectation. It sounds like, "I'm only saying this because I care," or "this is what's best for you." But beneath those words, there's often an underlying need to influence your decisions, shape your identity, or keep you aligned with what makes them comfortable. And for a long time, you responded to that. You adjusted your choices. You filtered your thoughts. You second-guessed your instincts. Not because you lacked intelligence, but because you were conditioned to trust their voice over your own. What felt like guidance was often limitation. What felt like closeness was sometimes control. But now, you see the difference. Real connection allows space. It respects individuality. It doesn't demand that you shrink, explain yourself endlessly, or abandon your truth to maintain harmony. It feels safe, not pressured. It supports your growth, not restricts it. Control, on the other hand, resists your independence. And once you recognize that, you can't participate the same way anymore. You start noticing the subtle cues, the tone shifts, the expectations, the guilt when you don't comply. You begin to feel when something is trying to pull you back into an old pattern, and instead of automatically adjusting, you pause. You choose differently. That's where everything changes, because when you stop responding to control, those dynamics lose their power. Conversations become strained, reactions become stronger. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because the old system no longer works on you, and that's what they're reacting to. You didn't disconnect from them, you disconnected from control. And in doing so, you made space for something real. Whether others meet you there or not is their choice. But you've already made yours to choose connection that honors you, not control that confines you. Your clarity disrupts their narrative about you. For a long time, there was a story about you, one that may not have been spoken directly, but was understood and reinforced through words, reactions, and expectations. Maybe you were labeled as too sensitive, difficult, the quiet one, or even the one who always needs help. Whatever the label was, it shaped how you were treated, and, at some point, how you saw yourself. That narrative served a purpose. It kept things predictable. It allowed others to relate to you in a fixed way. It justified certain behaviors toward you, and as long as you stayed within that identity, everything remained familiar, even if it wasn't fair. But your awakening disrupted that completely. You began to see yourself outside of that story. You questioned the labels. You recognized how they were formed, not from your truth, but from moments, misunderstandings, or even projections. And slowly, you stopped identifying with them. You started showing up differently, more grounded, more self-assured, more aware of who you are and what you deserve. And without needing to announce it, your presence began to contradict everything they thought they knew about you, and that's where the tension begins. Because when your reality no longer matches their narrative, it creates discomfort. People tend to hold on to the version of you that they understand, even if it's outdated or inaccurate. It's easier than adjusting their perspective or admitting they may have been wrong. So they may question your growth. They may downplay your change. They may even try to pull you back into that old identity subtly or directly. But here's what they can't ignore. You no longer see yourself the way they do, and that changes everything. Because once you release a false identity, you stop performing it. You stop reacting in ways that reinforce it. You stop shrinking to fit it. And without your participation, that narrative begins to fall apart. This is your power. Not forcing others to see you differently, but seeing yourself clearly enough that their version no longer defines you. You became the mirror they can't avoid anymore. There's a quiet power in who you've become, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable. Your growth, your awareness, your peace, it all reflects something back to the people around you. And that reflection is something they can no longer ignore. You've become a mirror, not by pointing fingers or calling things out, but simply by existing in truth. The way you carry yourself now, more grounded, more self-aware, more intentional, naturally highlights the contrast between who you are and what they may not have faced within themselves. And that can be uncomfortable, because your presence no longer supports illusion. It doesn't validate denial. It doesn't participate in patterns that avoid accountability. Instead, it quietly reveals them. Without saying much, you expose inconsistencies, unresolved emotions, and behaviors that were once hidden under privichka or silence. Before, your reactions may have distracted from what was really happening. Your emotions may have taken center stage, allowing others to avoid looking inward. But now, you don't react the same way. You don't engage in the same cycles. And without that distraction, the focus shifts back to them. And not everyone is ready for that level of reflection. Some may feel uneasy around you without fully understanding why. Others may become defensive, distant, or even critical. But their reaction isn't truly about you. It's about what your presence brings to the surface. Because when someone is faced with a mirror, they have two choices: reflect or resist. And many choose resistance, but your role was never to force awareness onto anyone. Your transformation is not a tool to change others, it's a result of choosing yourself. Still, the impact is undeniable. You shift the energy in every space you enter, simply by being aligned with truth. This is the highest level of growth, not needing to prove anything, not needing to explain everything, just being fully, authentically, and clearly. And in that clarity, everything false begins to reveal itself. You didn't wake up by accident. Everything you've been through, the confusion, the silence, the emotional battles no one saw, was leading you to this moment of clarity. And now that the blindfold is off, you're seeing everything for what it truly is, not filtered, not softened, not explained away, just truth. And yes, that truth can feel heavy, because it changes how you see people, it changes how you move, it even changes what you're willing to tolerate. But understand this, your awakening was never meant to destroy you, it was meant to free you. You're no longer the version of yourself that accepted less, questioned your worth, or stayed in places that drained you. You've evolved beyond that. And with that evolution comes distance from old patterns, old roles, and sometimes even old relationships. That's not loss, that's alignment. The truth is, not everyone will understand your growth. Some will resist it, some will feel uncomfortable around it, and some will try to pull you back into who you used to be. But you can't go back, because once you see clearly, you move differently. So don't shrink to make others comfortable. Don't silence your awareness to maintain peace, and don't question your growth just because it challenges others. You've come too far to return to confusion. If this message resonated with you, it's not a coincidence. You're exactly where you need to be. Stay aware, stay grounded, and most importantly, stay true to who you're becoming, because this is only the beginning.